actually, what we done last week, we only touched on the beginnings of the end part of chapter 40, where we talked about this creature called the behemoth. How many remember that? And how many also knew that I gave you a homework assignment? And I asked you to see if you can figure out what is this behemoth. Does anyone remember that? Okay, let's read it then from Job chapter 40, starting with verse 15, and then we'll get into chapter 41, which is our plan for today. So we read, this is what God says in verse 15, look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See how his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident. Though the Jordan gushes into his mouth, though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. And so we're going to look at that for a moment briefly. And just before we get into that, just remember that this was at the end of a conversation and a question time that God was having with Job, and Job was answering him. And God started to talk about his power and asking Job, if you could do a better job of running this universe, how would you do it? I'd like to see you try it, basically. And then he goes back into talking about two huge animals, and the first one is this thing called the behemoth. Now, you'll be probably glad to know that it's not a giant moth. Behemoth is not a giant moth. So what is the behemoth? Any ideas? Can I hear anyone say what they think it is? The ox. Well, we've heard of the ox mentioned before in previous chapters. Between chapters 38 and 39, there was the ox mentioned, also donkeys and horses and things like that. So now we've got this thing, which in Hebrew is huge mammal or huge beast. So what is it? And as you know, I said that commentators have come up with all different types of things. If you listen to some of the descriptions there, you might go, sounds like, could it be? You know, if someone was giving descriptions of it, what is it? Is it an elephant? Some people say it's a hippopotamus. Some of them would say, well, it's an elephant. It's huge, must be an elephant. Others have said, no, it's a hippo, but there's a few problems with that. And others said it's a crocodile. Okay, that's also a possibility. Others have said, no, it's definitely a dinosaur that is mentioning here. And others wouldn't even consider that possibility. There's no way that Job was in contact with dinosaurs. What is this thing? And so we're going to look at some of the clues that are in it. And there are some, and when I say it's this, whatever this mammoth creature is, I'm not saying it's a mammoth, but there are some extinct animals. So let's just consider some of these things. Well, first of all, let's look at a few of the clues. Verse 15 says there, now look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. Now, that tells you something, doesn't it? That God made this thing, whatever it is, along with man at the very beginning. And we know that God made all the beasts of the field and man on day 6 of creation. And also, it's a herbivore, because what does it say there? I made it along with you. He eats grass like an ox. So all of the animals apparently were herbivores until the flood. And then we read in Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 6, how that all changed. And God said you can eat meat. So this is just the thing. It was something that is a meat, not a meat eater, but a herbivore. That's the first thing. And then according to verse 16, see how his strength is in his hips. And perhaps that was why people said hips. It's got to be a hippo with hips, right? But that's not necessarily true, because there's some things that just don't seem to add up. So you got hips because A hippo, although it is quite bulky and everything, does it have what it says in verse 17? Look at this. First of all, verse 16. See how his strength is in his hips and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. And what is a cedar? Isn't that a cedar tree? He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. I've seen hippos, but I believe their tails are little stubby little things. Are they like cedars? No, so it's probably not a hippo in that sense. And then, of course, it says things like this in verse 18. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. So perhaps, well, when it says it's a cedar, his tail's like a cedar, it's not meaning that we take that literally, that's a cedar tree. Just like its ribs are not literally beams of, ribs are not made of bars of iron, neither are its bones beams of bronze. But it's just that it has such strength in it. But does the hippo really have that sort of tail? And then it says in verse 19, he is the first of the ways of God. And if you look that up in different translations, it's describing it as, let me see, he is the prime example of God's handiwork, and only its creator can threaten it. That's what it says in the New Living Translation. It's a prime example. God said that's an example of a huge beast. Okay, so there's that. And then we read, only him who made him can bring near his sword. It's such a thing that even if someone tried to say, I want to get up near and close to that thing with my sword, you can't get near it with the sword. So what is it describing? Because God says, I can do that. Nobody else can. Then in verse 20, this is the thing that threw me off. If it wasn't for verse 20, I would have thought this thing could be a crocodile. Listen to verse 20. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. So I'm thinking to myself, crocodiles don't usually eat on the mountains. I don't think this thing goes up and lives in the mountains and eats food there. So I can't say how it could be a crocodile. In verse 21, though, you do think it is a crocodile, because listen to this. He lies under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds and marsh. So in other words, this thing likes to hide in the swamps. Has anyone ever been to the Everglades in Miami or in Florida? Because there you've got a lot of crocodiles, and they like to hide amongst the marshes and the reeds and things like that. But this thing has been up feeding on the mountains and also going down into these places to hide. So what is this thing? The lotus trees cover him with their shade, likes to find shade, and the willows by the brooks surround him. So he likes to be surrounded by willow brooks and rivers, and all that kind of stuff is his habitat. And he likes to be in the river. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he's not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes in his mouth. It doesn't matter how strong the river current is. It doesn't bother him in the slightest. This thing is so undisturbed by any of that. Though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. Now, if you look that up, it simply means if someone was to try to catch this creature or pierce it or attack it in any way, it's not going to be an easy job at all. I mean, this thing, you can't catch it. It's massive. What is this thing? So having heard all those descriptions, does anyone know what we're talking about? Any clues at all? I simply cannot think that there's anything in existence that we know of today. Therefore, I have to conclude that perhaps it's some extinct animal. And you know how hunters are. There are hunters who would hunt anything just to have its head on their wall, right? You've got people said, look what I got today, and there's the rhino or the lion or the deer. But if they could find a behemoth and get its head on their wall, they'd do it, okay? And all these creatures have been hunted into the point of extinction. So I think it's that. But there's also the possibility, is it not possible that this could also be a double meaning here, that there's something that is so huge, so monstrous on the land that there's something that is, you cannot even conceive of it and control it. You've no power over it, Job. And that is the first of these creatures. That's why I titled this message, Job 41 and 42. Well, Job 40 and 41. Monsters of the land and the sea. Because we've looked at one. This is a huge animal. We've never seen anything like this thing, okay, on the land. But listen as we go into chapter 41. So are you ready for chapter 41 of Job today? Listen to this. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. Never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. Now, what we've got here is something entirely different. Not for something entirely different. What is the Leviathan? We said that the Hebrew word for behemoth means a huge beast or huge mammal, huge animal of some sort. But the word Leviathan is a huge sea creature, or perhaps a sea monster. Okay? And I would suggest that this is probably not good bedtime reading for children. Okay? If you read the descriptions of this thing, but perhaps you could close your eyes and try to imagine what sort of a creature is being described here, because he describes some things using some of the same language as he did for the behemoth. He asks a few questions like this, and I'll just turn over my page in my notes. Okay, I think it's a huge sea monster, to be honest, and I don't think it's any fish that we could imagine. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook? Although they do try to maybe use a hook. Can you use a hook to catch this guy? No. Or can you snare his tongue with a line? So here's some of the instruments that people are using to try, if they wanted to try to do fishing. Could you snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose? So there's a description. He has some sort of thing that you could maybe try putting through his nose. Not going to work. Or pierce his jaw with a hook. That's not going to work either. Will he make? And I think God is kind of joking around about this and saying, do you think that this huge sea monster is going to plead with you? Oh, please let me go. Please let me go. It says here, will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you, make promises to you? Will you take him as your servant forever? I mean, he's saying, would this creature act like that toward you? It's so ferocious, so monstrous a thing. Would you think that you're going to have that sort of a time with him? It's never going to happen. Then, and this reminded me some of the things in the Philippines, actually, because they do this type of thing. Will you play with him as with a bird? It's like you're going to catch it and use it as a little toy or a plaything. Are you going to do that with the Leviathan? Of course not. Or will you leash him for your maidens? In other words, are you going to put him on a piece of string or tie something around him and have your little girl take him for a walk or play with it as you would a plaything? It's not going to happen, right? It's just too much of a monster. Okay, will your companions make a banquet of him? And if you read a different translation on that, I think it says that, will the traders by the sea, it says here, will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? That's the ESV. You're never going to catch this thing and make anything of him. Listen to this. Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? I mean, whatever people have used to catch whales and other huge fish, they're not going to be successful with this one. Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. You'll never do it again. Never do it again. Because it's almost like, the way fishermen come home with long tales and stories about the fish that they caught. Are these guys going to even live to tell the tale of the time we had a fight with Leviathan and we caught Leviathan? Never going to happen. He says, remember the battle, never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. It sounds like when you read this that there's, I don't know if you've come across some of these old myths and Greek mythology and things like that, but there are There are stories of monsters of the deep that people have said that exist out there in the deepest seas, and fishermen have told stories of these things. And it's almost as if, is he touching on this a little bit and saying there's such a monster out there that you would be so afraid of, and fishermen are all afraid of? He says here, shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? I mean, you might look at a dolphin and a whale and go, wow, oh, wow. But this thing is so overwhelming that you'd just be so frightful of its very appearance. And listen to verse 10, no one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. And that's an interesting statement, because Job mentioned about stirring him up way back in Job chapter 3, verse 8. It talks about stirring up Leviathan. When I heard the word stirring up Leviathan and the possibility of trying to stir up, it reminded me of this phrase, stirring up the Kraken. Have you heard that before? Are you willing to stir up this sea monster that is deep beneath the sea? Do not do it, because it's going to overwhelm you and it's frightening, this thing. Don't try to stir up Leviathan. Okay, and the reason why God says is there is such a thing here, that whether it's real or imagined, you do not want to stir it up. And he says here, no one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? You know, isn't it amazing that God is saying, if you think the Leviathan is scary and is monstrous and you don't want to stir it up, how about this? How would you dare? Would you dare to stir me up in my wrath and my fury? You wouldn't want to do that. And the question is whether he's asking Job, is that what Job is doing? Is Job standing up against me? Is that what has been happening in some of the discourse with Job? Is Job daring to stand up against God and challenge God and challenge God's justice? Or is God just giving him a gentle reminder, you know who I am, don't you? You don't want to mess with me. And isn't it amazing that have you ever talked to atheists? And atheists will tell you, Christians just make up gods to calm their fears. You know, you're obviously afraid of dying and you're afraid of things. So you make up a god to kind of calm you down. Isn't that right? People do say this. Yet, who would think of a God like the God of the Bible? Who would come up with a God so frightening, so fearful, and so awesome, and so powerful as the God of the Bible, that in fact the Bible says, be careful of ever approaching this God. In fact, there's a verse, I wanted to just throw in one from the Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31 in the New Testament, because it does say there that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. I'll read it. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And people have got this sort of a approach to God, like, oh, he's so loving, he's so nice, which is true. He is loving and he's good, but nice is not a word I'll find in the Bible. But he's so loving, so powerful, and yet they treat him almost with no respect at all, but not realizing this is a God that you don't want to be messing with. You do not want to fall into his hands. And so God is just saying, just be aware that if you wouldn't dare stir up Leviathan, don't you dare stir me up. Don't you try to stand up against me, anybody. Now, in verse 11, it's not very clear in the King James Version or the New King James Version, because it says there, who has preceded me that I should pay him? And preceding almost says like come before God. And we know that there's plenty of references. I don't want to go into them right now, but there are plenty of references that speak about the fact that there's only one God, and there's none that came before God, none that came after God, all throughout Isaiah chapter 43, 44, 45, and 46. But that's not the point. He's not saying who has preceded me, but he's saying, who do I owe anything to that I have to pay them back? Does God owe anything to anybody? Let me ask that question. Does God owe anyone anything? No, he doesn't. In fact, you know why? God owns everything. Everything is his, isn't it? Listen to this. Who then has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. How would you like to own everything? Everything. Everything under heaven is mine. That's what God says. Now, why would he say that right in the middle of this text? For some reason, he just brings that out. And then he goes back to talking about the creature again. In verse 12, I will not conceal his limbs. his mighty power, or his graceful proportions. This thing sounds like it's graceful. What is this creature? Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Now, when I mentioned about don't read this to your children, if you were to describe this creature and say, here's a bedtime story, children. Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? Can you just imagine this thing and it's all its teeth, right? Smiling at you? No. His rows of scales and his pride shut up tightly as with a seal. No, one is so near the other that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. Now, the thing about that is he's got a wonderful armor against anyone trying to attack him. That's what it is. You can try attacking with your spear, but you can't get a spear in anywhere. And so he's very well protected. And if you look at all these things that people use against these creatures, such as the list of things that are mentioned there, I wrote them all down somewhere. Where is it? One moment. Yeah, you got sword, spears, darts and javelins, and slingshots, all kinds of things that people use against, but it's not going to get through the scales and the armor of its body. But here's what's very strange about this creature. This is where it gets really quite odd. If you read from verse 18, can you actually imagine this creature that is a sea monster? The Kraken, or 2,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jason and the Argonauts, or Sinbad, all of these stories, and go, there were lots of different monsters. Were they real or were they imagined? Is this thing really one of God's creatures? Because listen to verse 18. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning, whatever that means. Out of his mouth go burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot, and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Now, does anyone know any creature like that? What? It sounds like a dragon, right? Where do all these stories of and legends of dragons come from? Did someone actually say, yeah, there was that? Now, the best we can do on a cold, frosty morning is breathe out vapors. But this thing, it was breathing out gases, fire, brimstone, everything. So there is no creature that we know of today that does just like that. And so either this is something that did exist and is extinct, or it's something that represents a fierce thing that is part of myths and legends. Now, here's a very interesting point. The Hebrew people and people of the ancient Near East were afraid of the sea. That's why you got stories like Jonah saying, no, I don't want to get taken going across the sea, and he gets thrown into the sea. But the whole thing is the sea and chaos and the chaos monster, darkness and light, and God at creation having to overcome the darkness and overcome the chaos. These are all parts of myths and legends. And so is there such a creature that actually exists? Or is he saying this is the worst thing you could ever imagine? It's hard to know if it's talking about something real, like a fanciful or whatever it is, but we'll read on. We read this, verse 22, strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone, even as hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, so it obviously can extend itself, the mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings, they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does the spear, dart, or javelin, mentioned those earlier on. He regards iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones become like stubble to him. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the threat of javelins. His undersides, in other words, his belly, his undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire, whatever that means. He makes a deep boil like a pot. In other words, he's stirring the whole water up and it's boiling like a pot the way he moves around. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. So here's a thing that goes through water and leaves a wake behind it. I was thinking about a crocodile, and I thought, yeah, but the crocodile's not like this thing. But it seems to have a tail of some sort that would leave a wake behind it. And so on earth, now here's the thing. What is this thing? Does it actually exist? Did it actually exist? Well, verse 33 does say this. On earth there is nothing like him, which is made without fear. So I have to say that it sounds like something that does or did exist at some point, but is it also saying there's nothing like him because you can't even imagine something because it doesn't actually exist? It's hard to actually know. So we're going to have to look into a few more details and get some help here. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. So here's a thing which has got fear of nobody or nothing. Now, here's the thing. We're no closer to finding out, are we? What is this Leviathan? Except that there are other places in the Bible where Leviathan is mentioned. And so this would help us. So would you turn over to Isaiah chapter 27. And interestingly enough, it gives us some information on Leviathan here. It says in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1, in that day, the Lord with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. Now that sounds pretty much like the same thing, doesn't it? Except that this one is called the fleeing serpent and the twisted serpent. And there's something about the character of this thing which is twisted. And why does God have to punish it? Unless it sort of represents evil as well. So although it sounds like a reptile, okay, that is in the sea, yet it needs to be punished. So it seems to represent two things: a real creature plus something that is morally needing to be punished. Okay? Not only that, but we also have a text over here in Psalm 74. This is quite interesting. Psalm 74 and verses 13 to 14. It says, if I can find it. Yes. Who divided the sea by your strength? Who broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters? You broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces and gave him as food to the people inhabiting the wilderness. What does that say? More than one head. This thing has got more than one head, doesn't it? Does it not say there? You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters. You broke the heads of Leviathan. How many heads does this thing have? Do we know any creature on earth that has more than one head? Because if this has more than one head, it seems to be representing more than just some creature, doesn't it? Well, sounds like a scary monster, but then if you go over to Psalm 104, we also read about it. Psalm 104 and verses 24 to 26. It says, O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions, this great and wide sea, in which are innumerable teeming things, living things, both small and great. And these are some tiny little things, tiny little fish like Nemo, or some massive sea creatures, sea monsters. There the ships sail about. There is that Leviathan, which you have made to play there. What on earth? This guy's sounds like a playful creature as well. It sounds like partially it's a real creature, and then at the same time it's something that is a twisted serpent that needs to be dealt with. And I find it very interesting, as I come to a close on this, I find it very interesting that when we get over to the book of Revelation, what do we find there in Revelation chapter 13? We find that there are some creatures. I will point out that Revelation chapter 12 talks about a massive serpent And you can read that at your own time. It talks about a dragon as well. It's some sort of we'll read verse 12, Revelation chapter 12, verse 3. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. So what does that talk about? This is some sort of a dragon or serpent, just like we're reading about, probably like Leviathan. But over in 13, this is what I want to look at. If you look in your Bible, you'll notice that there are 2 headings in chapter 13. And what are they? Interestingly enough, the beast from the sea, and the next one says the beast from the earth. Isn't that interesting that there are 2 beasts? We saw there are 2 beasts in the book of Job. One is a beast of the land and the other is a beast of the sea. Now, could it be that this is just a coincidence that in the book of Job it says it in that order, but in the book of Revelation it's in the reverse order? But he talks about this beast. Now, I'm just going to read this real quickly. Revelation chapter 13. Then I stood on the sand of the sea and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of the heads as if it had been mortally wounded. You get the picture? There's some sort of a earthly creature coming up out of the sea, and then there's a dragon there giving power to it. Okay, and then I just want to jump down real quickly to verse 11. This is the beast from the earth. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke like a dragon, and he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed, and he performed signs and wonders and so on. There's a lot to read there, but the point of it simply is there's these mentions of these beasts, and they're not some physical thing on earth. They're actually symbolic of evil world powers, evil empires, evil people, political structures, antichrists, the beasts, and all the things that are to do with end time events. And why is it that these are mentioned, and why did Job get told about these 2 creatures, the monster from the earth and the monster from the sea? It's as if he's being told, no matter what it is, and Job, there may be things that you can't even take on, you can't even imagine. And if you'll remember, way back at the beginning of Job, did you know that Job was attacked by 2 different crowds of people and 2 different various things that attacked his family? Listen to this, and we'll just close with these remarks. Job chapter 1, it says in, let me see, verses 15 and 17, that there was the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans. They attacked and stole all his cattle and sheep. They came and did that. But then there was a tornado that came and blew down his house and killed his children. And there was fire that came down and burned up his sheep. That lightning from heaven. So whether these are powers that you have no control over, things that are so monstrous, so evil that you say, how could I ever take on something like that? You may say, we want to take on the Kraken. You'll never take on some of these things. You'll never have the power to deal with it yourself. But God has said, all of these things are under my control. You have nothing to fear. So if God is saying that to Job, saying, don't you fear, don't you worry about whatever these monsters are, real or imagined, I can control them. I have them under my control. Others cannot approach them and deal with them, but I can. And I thank God that we don't have to live in fear of what's happening in the world around us. We can trust and absolutely know God has everything under control, whether it's living things or monstrous empires or political systems or religions or evil of every sort. God himself is in absolute control of all things. And we thank God that we don't have to live in fear of man or things on this earth, but we should live in the fear of God. Trust him and everything will be all right. Amen. Well, I'm going to close there because that's a hard chapter to go through. Okay. But at least we covered it. And so next week we'll be able to finish with the book of Job, which will be chapter 42. Amen. So I'm going to ask